As Canada's most populous province considers tunneling a new highway under the existing Highway 401, one of the busiest in the world reaching up to 18 lanes wide, we want to tackle a related argument against housing. The same urbanists who say just build more lanes is doomed to fail never see that just build more units is doomed for the same reason. This is a reference to induced demand or induced traffic, a concept that describes how new roads or lanes tend to fill up and not help congestion as much as promised or at all. In the short term, people take more trips by car and are less careful about avoiding rush hour. In the medium term, people and businesses see the new road capacity and move to the area to use it. The question critics are asking then is that if building more roads is futile, doesn't the same apply to housing? There are two details about induced traffic that need to be clarified. First, it doesn't mean that building more lanes is futile, only that it won't necessarily be a sustainable fix for congestion. If your goal is to encourage more car-centric development or get more people driving more places, building and expanding highways is exactly what you want to do. Second, as we mentioned in this video more than 3 years ago, induced traffic is not infinite. The extreme interpretation of induced traffic is that all roads always end up congested, and that's clearly not true. Lots of rural and remote roads experience next to no congestion, and if you look at the TomTom traffic index, there are cities that experience not zero congestion, but relatively little. These are mainly smaller cities in the US Rust Belt with tons of highways and flat or declining populations. Induced traffic doesn't mean that it's literally impossible to outbuild congestion, but it does close in on being practically impossible for bigger, denser, and faster-growing cities. Why is that? Number one is price. Most roads are free to use. When you give things away for free, you will tend to have shortages. Driving does cost money, but the biggest costs are up front. Once you own and insure a vehicle, each mile or kilometer you travel tends to be relatively cheap, especially if you live in a country like the United States where gas is so cheap they sell it by the gallon. There's also depreciation and wear and tear, but those costs aren't as visible. It turns out that you can actually solve congestion by just charging for road use. During a typical rush hour in Toronto, Highway 401 is severely congested, but the tolled highway to the north, the 407, flows smoothly. A lot of people hate tolls, but they work. The second reason congestion is such a recurring problem is that cars are very big and take a lot of space to move relatively few people. Buses, trains, and bikes can all experience congestion too, in somewhat different ways, but they're much less prone to it due to how little space they use per person. If you hear someone say their bus gets stuck in traffic, it's almost always car traffic, not other buses. We're not aware of any 18-lane wide transportation corridor in the world dedicated to buses, trains, or bikes, let alone one that gets congested like the 401. That only happens with cars. Cars are even less space efficient on city streets due to the prevalence of street parking. Often only half of car lanes actually get used for travel because the rest get used for storage. And in particular, it's hard to add capacity to car corridors. Think of all the options to add capacity to a transit route. Run more buses, run articulated buses, upgrade to rail, run more trains, run longer trains. How do you add capacity to a road for cars? You build more lanes, mainly. If you're outside of a city with empty space, that might be straightforward. But in built-up areas, there usually isn't a lot of extra space lying around, especially since most cities have stopped demolishing neighborhoods for highways like happened here in Quebec City in the 1970s. When your options for road expansion are limited, you'll find that any new capacity that does get added is going to fill up quickly. Ironically, the biggest boost to car capacity in urban areas would probably come from getting rid of on-street parking, but like tolls, that's politically unpopular. So induced traffic is such a problem because roads for cars are a low-capacity resource that's difficult to expand and given away for free, resulting in perpetual problems of congestion. Does housing work just like that? Well, contrary to roads, housing isn't given away for free. It's sold or rented for a price on the market, and we know that price on the market is determined by the intersection of supply and demand. Is housing inherently low capacity and difficult to expand? No. Unlike roads where you're limited to 1 or maybe 2 stories, housing can be built basically as high as we need. If we wanted to replicate induced traffic for housing, imagine that housing was limited to 1 or 2 stories, and that it was given away for free. All you need to pay is moving expenses. In that scenario, you would have persistent shortages. The supply of housing wouldn't be able to match demand. When people make these arguments, they're taking the lesson from induced traffic that the supply of things can never keep up with demand. If the supply of roads can never keep up with demand, then the supply of housing can never match demand. But this isn't a general principle at all. We normally expect mass production of a good to make it cheaper and more accessible. Here's a passage on the history of bikes. Bicycles were expensive. Until they were mass-produced, only those with money could afford one. Owning a bicycle was an indication of social standing in the 1890s. Or look at LED light bulbs more recently, where the price goes down and the quantity installed goes up. Is manufacturing more bicycles or light bulbs doomed to fail? Just one more shipment of light bulbs, bro. The housing situation isn't the exact same as those other goods. The supply of bicycles and LED light bulbs ramped up because of technological advances allowing cheap mass production. In the case of housing, we already have the technology, more or less. It's just a question of allowing it. But imagine we had laws limiting the production of bicycles or LED light bulbs. Prices would be higher and access would be lower. Similarly, when you limit the supply of housing, prices are higher and access is lower. If there's any kernel of truth to induced traffic applying to housing, it's that one city on its own, especially a smaller one, can't solve a regional housing crisis. Jersey City builds way more housing per capita than the rest of the New York metro area, but there's probably a limit to how cheap this place can be when it's picking up the slack of nearby jurisdictions underbuilding. One more apartment in Jersey City, bro, isn't going to fix New York's housing crisis, but if the rest of the metro area built like Jersey City? If other nearby cities in the Northeast Corridor like Boston also started to build like Jersey City? Second, just like some people respond to more roads by driving more, some people would respond to a saner housing market by consuming more housing. If rents in your city dropped by 20%, you might keep the same size of place and pay less money. Or you might spend the same amount of money to upgrade to a bigger place. Or you might choose to move to a more convenient location. All of these are legitimate choices that improve your quality of life and don't take away from other people's, to any substantial degree. One of the problems of induced traffic on roads is that more driving has a lot of bad consequences, from pollution to traffic injuries and death, not just for drivers themselves, but also for pedestrians and cyclists. People moving closer to work or getting an extra room to have a child doesn't have the same negative side effects. In conclusion, induced traffic is a phenomenon for roads where, as a low-capacity resource that's difficult to expand and given away for free, they're prone to congestion and gridlock, especially in large, dense, or growing cities. The answer to congestion isn't to stop building transportation infrastructure. It's to add tolls to congested roads and highways, ideally dynamic congestion pricing based on time of day or traffic levels, and to invest a major part of your transportation funding into higher capacity transportation infrastructure like public transit. Similarly, if you have a housing crisis, the answer isn't to stop building housing because it's futile. It's to build higher capacity housing like townhouses and apartments, not just in one neighborhood, but ideally across the city or region. A lot of people seem to take the lesson from induced traffic that the supply of things can never keep up with demand. But the real lesson is that large or growing cities need high-capacity transportation and housing solutions. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.